This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, the room that wasn't there. The day in the Pig family's house was as usual. Peppa and George were playing in the living room while Mummy Pig was cooking dinner and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Everything was familiar, cozy. But in the evening, something strange happened. When Peppa went upstairs to her room, she noticed a door at the end of the hallway. It had never been there. The house wasn't that big, and Peppa knew exactly where everything was. At the end of the hallway, there had always been just a wall, but now there was a door. Ordinary-looking, wooden, with a round handle. George followed her, looking confused. A cold feeling settled inside Peppa. Maybe Mummy and Daddy had remodeled something. Maybe it had always been there and she just hadn't noticed. But the longer she stared, the more wrong it seemed. She had never heard anyone building anything new. And yet, the door was there. It was calling to be opened. Peppa cautiously reached for the handle. Inside was a room. Empty, bare walls, a dusty wooden floor. But the air inside was heavy, stale, as if no one had stepped inside for a very, very long time. Peppa took a step forward. Silence. But there was a feeling like someone was there, like someone had just been standing in that corner and moved the moment she entered. George tugged at her hoof, but Peppa didn't move. Something was wrong. They couldn't hear the television from the living room. They couldn't hear their parents' footsteps. Only silence. And then, a step. Peppa turned sharply, but the room was empty, complete suffocating stillness. And then, the door began to close, slowly, soundlessly, as if someone was pushing it from the other side. Peppa and George lunged for the exit, but too late. The door slammed shut. Darkness. The room had no window, no drafts, not even a crack of light. Only absolute darkness and silence. Peppa yanked at the handle. It wouldn't budge. George curled into a ball, clutching his dinosaur tightly. And then Peppa heard breathing. Deep. Quiet. Not hers. Not George's. Someone else was in this room. Something was standing in the dark. Very close. This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig. Voices on the second floor. It was a late evening in the Pig family's house. The wind howled outside, rushing through the dark streets. Rain drummed against the roof, trickling down the windows in thin streams. Everything seemed like a normal rainy night, yet something in the air felt wrong. Peppa and George sat in the living room, wrapped in warm blankets. The television flickered with a silly program, but neither of them could focus on the screen. The house was too quiet. Even the sound of the rain felt muted, as if the walls had thickened. Then they heard it. Voices. They came from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor and talking. But they both knew that Mummy and Daddy Pig had already gone to bed. Their door was closed. There was no one else in the house. Peppa froze. George clutched his dinosaur. The voices were muffled but clear. The words were indistinct, yet it was obvious that someone was speaking. A whisper. A quiet laugh. Slow footsteps, the floor creaking under the weight. Peppa lifted her head, staring at the staircase. The second floor was swallowed by darkness. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the top step was sinking into a void. The voices didn't stop. They sounded wrong, like someone was pretending to sound familiar, but was failing. The voices grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. And then they began to descend. Step, pause, step, pause. Something was coming down. Peppa and George didn't move. Their hearts pounded so loudly that it felt like the whole house could hear them. But the worst was yet to come. When it reached the middle of the staircase, the upstairs light flickered. For a brief moment, they saw a shadow, tall, stretched, and completely still. The footsteps continued. The voices were right there. Peppa couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed George's hoof and squeezed her eyes shut. suddenly, everything stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices, only silence. Peppa slowly opened her eyes. The top of the stairs was empty, but she knew that something was still there. It just didn't want to be seen. Peppa Pig, the new friend. One sunny morning, Peppa and George were playing in the garden when a strange piglet approached them. He had pale gray skin, odd eyes with a reddish tint, and a quiet, muffled voice. "Hi, I'm Simon," he said with a smile. "Hi, Simon." "Do you want to play with us?" Peppa asked cheerfully. Simon nodded, but his smile seemed a little off to Peppa. George also looked uneasy, but they decided Simon was just their new friend. At first, they played harmless games. Simon suggested hide and seek, but chose the strangest hiding places, like behind the trees where no one ever hid. When George tried to find him, he suddenly heard a whisper behind him, even though Simon should have been far away. "It's just a game," Simon said, stepping out from the shadows. By evening, things got even stranger. Simon asked to stay for dinner, and Mummy Pig invited him to join. "Are you from the next village?" Mummy Pig asked. "I'm from far away," Simon replied quietly, not taking his eyes off his plate. During dinner, he hardly ate, and instead stared at everyone, especially Peppa. After the family went to bed, Peppa noticed Simon still standing in the garden, staring at the house. The next day, Simon came back. He started inviting Peppa and George to play unsettling games. One game was called Look into the Dark. Simon led them into a dark corner of the shed and said, "Look closely. You'll see something interesting." But instead of something fun, Peppa felt a chilling cold, and Simon's shadow in the darkness seemed to move on its own. One evening, Peppa heard whispering outside her bedroom door. She cautiously peeked out and saw Simon standing in the hallway. His eyes were now glowing red. "Peppa, come with me. We'll be best friends forever," he whispered. Terrified, Peppa called for her parents, but when they arrived, Simon was gone. The next day, George disappeared. All they found was his toy dinosaur, abandoned in the garden. Simon appeared again and said, "Don't worry, he's with me. He's happy." Peppa realized Simon wasn't a friend, but something far more sinister. She tried to make him leave, but he just smiled and said, "You're next." Peppa Pig, the twin brother. One evening, Peppa Pig's family was expecting a guest. Daddy Pig's twin brother, Gilbert, was coming to visit for the first time in many years. Daddy Pig often talked about how inseparable they were as children, but Gilbert had moved far away, and they had barely seen each other since. That evening, the doorbell rang. Standing on the doorstep was Gilbert. He looked exactly like Daddy Pig, but something about him was off. His smile was too forced, and his eyes seemed empty. During dinner, he barely spoke, silently observing everyone. His movements were unnatural, as if he was learning how to use utensils for the first time. George hid behind his chair the whole time, and Peppa felt uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange creaking sound. In the hallway, in front of the mirror, stood Gilbert. He wasn't just looking at his reflection. His reflection was moving with a slight delay, as if struggling to mimic his movements. At one point, he suddenly turned towards Peppa. In the morning, Mummy Pig seemed worried. Daddy Pig was gone. Gilbert was still in the house, acting as if he had always been there. His voice was muffled at first, but as the hours passed, it started to sound more and more like Daddy Pig's. Throughout the day, he imitated Daddy Pig's habits. He sat with a newspaper, tried to joke, but his laughter was hollow. As evening fell, a muffled voice was heard outside. It sounded like Daddy Pig. He was calling for help. Peppa rushed to the door, but Gilbert was already there. He looked at her and slowly smiled. At that moment it became clear. Daddy Pig wasn't coming back. Gilbert had already taken his place.